Captains, welcome to our naval cinema. Let's watch the Naval Legends marathon together. It includes the best episodes of the series in honor of the 5th anniversary of World of Warships. We have enough tickets for the show for everybody, so invite your friends and share this video across your social networks. This is episode 3. During the marathon, I'll be giving out some gifts. Let me remind you of how that works. We take some parts from the announcement. Stay on the lookout for bonus codes that will appear in each episode of the historical marathon. As with the in-game daily shipments, all gifts are revealed in advance. Each bonus code will also provide you access to a combat mission chain. Complete all the chains to get 4 containers of the new 5 Epochs of the Navy collection and 1 million credits. Want even more gifts? If we manage to get the indicated number of new subscribers by the time each video is published, the credits will be replaced with coal. If we get the indicated number of subscribers for every episode, the combat missions will bring you a total of 10,000 coal. You can learn more about it on our website. The link is in the description. To create new ship models, we look for sources in archives, notes, museums, and literature all around the world. We strive to recreate ships and their on-deck objects as accurately as possible from a historical and functional perspective. Today's episode of the marathon is dedicated to armament. Anti-aircraft defenses, torpedoes, and carrier squadrons are features that make our game so diverse. We'll begin with the famous anti-aircraft guns manufactured by Swedish company AB Bofors. These were the most widespread and utilized means of AA defense during World War II. Enjoy.
They were designed to be the best. They met enemies face to face, endured tragedies and enjoyed victories. They went down in history due to the bravery of their crews. They are the ships that deserve to be called Naval Legends.
US battleship Alabama, British cruiser Belfast, and Polish destroyer Błyskawica. These ships are very different, but they all have one thing in common. The Bofors L60, one of the best automatic anti-aircraft guns of World War II. It is estimated that this model of 40mm automatic cannon shot down more airplanes than all other anti-aircraft guns put together. Caliber, 40mm. Barrel weight, 103 kilograms. Barrel length, 56 calibers, 2,250mm. Loading principle, clips, 4 shots each. Rate of fire, 120 rounds per minute. Shell type, primarily fragmentation. Shell weight, around 900 grams. Maximum vertical range, 7,160 meters. Guns were installed in single, coaxial, quadruple, and 6-barreled mounts.
She became a very efficient gun for anti-aircraft and surface targets. As time progressed, the first of the Bofors that came online with the Royal Navy were hand-driven in terms of elevation and training, and they had a very basic sight system, and again, like a lot of early systems, they were reliant on training, ability of the aimers and the gun crew.
The specifics of World War II artillery relies on the fact that the smaller the caliber is, the more it depends on the gun crew, on their cohesion in combat. The performance characteristics of light guns, anti-aircraft guns, and Bofors in particular, are a combination of the artillery mount itself and the training and coordination of its crew. Especially in battle, when tensions are running very high, there's no time to think, and you need to move very fast, turn around, load new shells, and start firing. And all this happens automatically, without thinking. After a battle, sailors often couldn't even remember what they were doing. That level of performance was achieved through constant training.
This weapon is operated by a crew of 4, 3 on the mounting, the gun layer, the gun trainer, the loader. The fourth member carries the ammunition from the magazine and loads them into the clips on the side of the gun.
The L60 was developed in neutral Sweden. Bofors, a metallurgy company, started manufacturing cannons around the 1870s. Then it was owned by the famous Alfred Nobel for a while. And after World War I, Bofors actively cooperated with the German Krupp consortium. In March 1932, the official trials of the automatic anti-aircraft cannon L60 were completed, and it was put on the market. In 1933, British and American military engineers studied the gun and were quite impressed. The Swedish system was more effective than the obsolete British Vickers pom-poms and had more firepower than the Chicago pianos used by the US. The maximum vertical range of Bofors was almost twice that of the British gun, and though the Swedish system had a slightly lower rate of fire than its American counterpart, the shells it used were twice as heavy. Great Britain, the USA and 10 other countries purchased a license to produce the gun. And by the beginning of World War II, Bofors exported their L60 to 18 countries on different continents. In particular, Denmark, Greece, Egypt, Siam, Australia and Argentina. It wasn't just the Allies that used the Bofors L60. Japanese forces captured several British guns in Singapore, and only their underdeveloped industry prevented them from mass producing them. The German Navy used L60s captured in Poland, Norway and France from 1939, under the designation Flak 28. They were installed on submarines and cruisers Admiral Hipper and Prince Eugen. However, the Swedish gun wasn't ideal and required modernization.
After 300 rounds, it would be too hot and require the barrel to be changed. The barrel is air-cooled and therefore the ambient temperature plays a great part in how long it would actually require to cool down.
During an intense battle, several hundreds or even thousands of shots are fired. That's why the issue of barrel replacement is so vital. This is why the gun crew was trained to carry out this maintenance under combat conditions. They could complete the procedure in mere seconds.
The mechanical drive system on ship-based anti-aircraft mounts would break down due to its exposure to salt water and needed to be replaced with a hydraulic one. The air cooling of the barrel also had to be replaced with water cooling. Also, some design modifications were required to mass-produce the gun. One of the main problems of the Bofors L60's application was a high reliance on the training and skills of the gun crew.
The job of the loader is to carry or load the gun by lifting the clip, dropping into the weapon. So once he has done that, he then taps the gun layer on his head to let him know the gun is loaded.
Loading a gun like this wasn't easy. Ammunition had to be taken out of a box and carried to the gun. As the gun constantly rotated, the carrier had to run around it with a clip of shells in his hands to pass it to the loader.
This position on the gun is known as the trainer's position, and these handles are turned or reversed to allow the gun to move backwards and forwards on the target using the gratical sight in front of you. Following the tracer being fired from the gun, we can adjust for aim off if we are too far in front or too far behind the target, to allow the other side of the gun, which is the layers side, to then manufacture the elevation for the target.
As time went on, the gun developed, and so that we could come away from the hand-driven gun, she was turned into a hydraulic-driven gun, so she had pressure tanks and oils and such like, which sped up the training and the elevation of the gun so that they could lock onto targets quicker.
This is the gun layer's position. He was also the captain of the gun and responsible for giving orders to the rest of the crew. He would, for instance, initiate the loading sequence by telling the loader to bring the gun to half cock. This means that the weapon can then be loaded with rounds into the auto feeder. He was also responsible for aiming the weapon using the 300-knot sight in front of him, using the tracers from the rounds to adjust accordingly.
The sight arrangement was going away from the spiderweb type of sight to a mirror type of sight, which was basically what we'd call a head-up display today.
On small displacement ships, anti-aircraft guns were aimed manually, but on cruisers, battleships and aircraft carriers, the firing data was produced by directors, special systems that controlled anti-aircraft artillery by calculating targeting parameters and sending them centrally to the receiving devices on guns. The information on target parameters was supplied by anti-aircraft rangefinders and later by gun radars.
The command to engage or fire comes directly from the command, and without further ado, the gun captain would press the firing push. As long as he held his foot on the firing push, the gun would continue to fire as long as it had enough ammunition in the hopper to keep feeding it.
The guns created a fire barrage, which was almost impossible for a single aircraft or entire squadrons to penetrate. You can see it in old newsreels. There's literally a wall of fire in the air, and some plane trying to get through it. The probability of an aircraft breaking through to its target, for example an aircraft carrier or some other ship, is very, very small.
The Bofors L60 proved its worth during World War II. The anti-aircraft gun Bofors L60 became its logical continuation.
The human factor is crucial in wars. A man can become frightened, maybe poorly trained, or something unexpected can happen to them. As a result, the struggle to minimize the influence of the human element and to increase the gun's survivability and rate of fire led to the development of the modernized Bofors L70, which required minimal human input if compared to the very first Bofors gun, such as the L60.
However, the L60 remained in use on some ships. In 1982, during the Falklands War, which involved Great Britain and Argentina, the British managed to shoot down a jet plane using this Bofors gun. Even in the 1970s, when artillery was gradually replaced by missile systems, Bofors cannons remained in service. Not only the upgraded L70s, but also the veteran L60. It can still be found on some German minesweepers and the heavily armed US AC-130 gunships, which provide fire support to ground units.
Bofors guns weren't the only AA guns to be used out at sea. Orlagun AA guns were also widely used by naval forces worldwide. Let's keep watching.
Of all the weapons used by the warring parties in World War II, a special place is occupied by a gun from a Swiss company, Oerlikon. This autocannon was operated by the militaries on both sides of the front line, but only the Allies managed to reveal its full potential. Using the Swiss-designed weapon, The Allied navies provided their ships with highly effective air defense.
The Oerlikon is a Swiss-designed gun made in the UK under licence, and it was introduced into the Royal Navy in 1940.
Specifications of the Oerlikon anti-aircraft gun. Caliber 20mm, barrel weight with breech block from 64 to 68 kilograms, gun length 2,210mm, ammunition feed, drum magazine holding 45, 60, 75 or 100 rounds. Rate of fire from 250 to 320 rounds per minute. The guns were fitted in single, twin and quadruple mountings.
The gun is used for fast surface targets and for anti-aircraft as well. So the gun was fitted to many naval ships, from aircraft carriers right down to the smallest minesweepers.
In 1941, England commissioned battleship Duke of York with 6 Oerlikon cannons on board. It was the first British warship armed with Swiss anti-aircraft guns. One of the key requirements that the British put forward for Oerlikons was that they be operable and maintainable for unqualified personnel, like fishermen and sailors from the merchant fleet. This condition proved to be quite far-sighted. Before World War II kicked off, Great Britain ordered 1,500 guns from Switzerland and purchased a license for their production. By 1943, single-barrel Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns were no longer effective against fast and well-protected enemy aircraft. A good solution to this problem was the development of multi-gun mounts.
This is a 20mm Oerlikon Mark 11 mounting fitted with 2 20mm cannons, each capable of firing up to 350 rounds a minute per gun. However, the magazine only holds 60 rounds. So the rate of fire is dependent upon the crew's ability to resupply magazines to the gun throughout the action.
The twin mounts were fed with ammunition from the left and right-hand sides. To avoid mistakes during loading, the magazine for the left gun was painted in a bright colour.
This is the 60-round magazine which fits on the cannon. This one is empty but is still very heavy. Imagine it filled with 60 rounds. Fits on the cannon like this and would be changed perhaps 3 or 4 times during an engagement. The loader's job is not just to load the magazine. She has to put the bullets or the shells inside the magazine. Each shell is individually loaded into the magazine, pre-greased to allow for lubrication through the firing system. As you can see, the aimer uses his body weight to move the mounting in a training motion. The elevation is adjusted by the hand wheel you can see here. When he's given the command by the gunnery controller, and once he has got the gun onto the target, he calls aimer target and is given the command to engage. At that point, he takes the safety catch off and fires the weapon.
When a shot is fired, gunpowder gases apply pressure to the projectile, which starts moving out of the barrel, and the cartridge, which pushes the breech, makes it slide along the barrel. The weight of the breech and the return force of the spring, pressed by it, are matched in such a way so that the moment the projectile leaves the barrel, a spent cartridge is ejected from the breech block and the next round is fed to her place from the magazine. At this moment, the recoil spring pushes the breech back, ramming the shell into the chamber.
There are two loaders for this gun, one for the right gun and one for the left. Obviously, they don't just lift full magazines onto the gun and take the empty ones away. Their duties are also to act as the emergency crew. Should anything happen to the aimer, who sits on the left-hand side, then the gun can be fired manually by one person from the back of the gun here.
The guns in the twin mount fire in turn. As a result, its cyclic rate of fire is about 600 rounds per minute. The Oerlikon was used on ships as a short-range anti-aircraft gun. Its effective range of fire was up to 2 kilometers. You can say it was a last-chance weapon, especially for American ships, as they had to face Japanese kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. During the war, Oerlikon autocannons were extensively installed on the ships of the Allies. For example, the American Essex-class aircraft carriers were equipped with up to 50 Oerlikon guns. Therefore, the number of people on board the ships became significantly larger due to the anti-aircraft gun crews.
Remembering that all the crew are actually linked together by the gunnery control communication system, they all can hear the commands from the gunnery director platform and the master gunner. This box relates to the Type 6 gyro sight and is the controlled inputs which are given to him by the gunnery director platform personnel prior to the start of the engagement, and set such things as wind speed, direction and air temperature which affect the ballistics of the ammunition. If, during the engagement, which obviously is very noisy, there is a need to stop firing, the gunnery director officer in the gunnery director platform will press the check fire bell, which operates this bell you see here. And this rings continuously until the aimer replies through his communication system, check, 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 which informs the gunnery officer that he has stopped firing.
During World War II, the Allies produced over 300,000 Oerlikon cannons. Many of them were later modified and upgraded, but in general, they still remained a Swiss design. The gun was too advanced for the time when it was developed in the early 1930s, and only when World War II broke out did this cannon occupy a niche where it was unmatched on both opposing sides. According to US statistics, from December 1941 through September 1944, as many as 32% of all Japanese aircraft were shot down by naval Oerlikon guns. In the second half of 1942, about 48% of enemy aircraft losses resulted from the use of these small caliber cannons. After the war, the 20mm Oerlikon AA gun remained in service with many navies around the globe, until it was inevitably replaced by more advanced systems. However, even today, you can still see the World War II design Oerlikon guns installed on some small patrol ships.
In our game, torpedoes can be either of the standard or deep water varieties for ships, or the aviation type for torpedo bombers. It's one of the most dangerous armament types in naval battles, but it requires a specific set of player skills to deploy effectively. History has seen some unusual ways of utilizing torpedoes. The next episode is dedicated to the wonder weapon of the Italian Navy, the Miali manned torpedo. Let's find out how the Regia Marina intended to regain control over the seas with this weapon.
We're currently in the warehouse for the Explosion Museum now, where we keep many of our artifacts, very interesting guns.
At the beginning of World War II, Italy had quite a powerful navy. However, it wasn't powerful enough to take control of the Mediterranean Sea away from Great Britain. Starting from the 1920s, when the fascists came to power, Rome wanted to take back the Mare Nostrum, having ruled it 2,000 years prior. However, London clearly asserted who the leading power of the Mediterranean was at that time, with the havoc wreaked by 20 English torpedo bombers in November 1940. The Italians understood that they couldn't beat the British Navy out in the open, so they devised a plan for a covert war.
What we have here is a two-man submersible submarine that was designed by the Italians and used in the Second World War. This submersible submarine is an open submarine that is used for attacking ships that are tied alongside in their home ports, i.e. their own harbours.
It wasn't a brand new idea. At the end of World War I, the Italians developed and successfully employed a human torpedo. Two frogmen could covertly approach an enemy ship while controlling a torpedo apparatus. They detached the charge, transported in the torpedo bow, and suspended it under the ship's bottom on a tow line between bilge keels. They set the detonation time using a simple clock. In the mid-1930s, Italian forces renewed their interest in human torpedoes. Mussolini thought of this as the super weapon that was capable of destroying the British Navy, which threatened the Duce's imperial ambitions. In 1935, the Italians designed an experimental prototype based on the 533mm torpedo used by their navy. That same year, in the mouth of the Serchio River, between La Spezia and Livorno, the Italians established a secret guided torpedo training base, where the assault fleet frogmen could master the super weapon. The first torpedo prototypes were extremely hard to control and broke down often. That's why the Italian sailors nicknamed the apparatus a maiale, a pig.
The guidance system for this is all wires, so it's very difficult to steer. It's even more difficult to steer once the charges have gone, because you've got no bow as such to help you steer the chariot in the same place. When this was in use, many times this would be abandoned anyway, and the divers would be left to their own devices to find their own way back to the ship where they came from.
Model SLC, Siluro a lente corsa, slow-running torpedo, 1940. Its length, including the warhead, was 7.3 meters. Width of the apparatus was slightly more than half of a meter. Height at the protection plate level, 1 meter. Weight, including the warhead, 1,588 kilograms. Weight of the warhead at the earlier design stage was 220 kilograms. At the later stages, 250 or 350 kilograms. Power plant, 1 electric motor, 1.6 horsepower. Power supply, a storage battery. Operating voltage 60 volts. Maximum speed up to 3 knots. Submergence depth up to 30 meters. Cruising range up to 15 miles. Crew 2 people. In 1943, Italian engineers designed a new guided torpedo model and called it Siluro San Bartolomeo, the St. Bartholomew torpedo.
The cockpit is open to water, so the divers will be wearing a full diving gear, which is their diving tanks, their masks and all the tubes that go with it. So as you can imagine, it's not very comfortable and it can be quite awkward to travel around in that way.
Model SSB 1943. Length 6.8 meters. Width 0.8 meters. Height 1 meter. Weight, including the warhead, 2,200 kilograms. The carrier could be equipped with either a single 300 or 400 kilogram warhead, or 2 consecutively loaded warheads at 180 or 200 kilograms each. Power plant, 1 electric motor, 7.5 horsepower, supplied with a storage battery. Operating voltage, 60 volts. Maximum speed, 4 knots. Operating submergence depth, up to 30 meters. Crew, 2 people. On June the 10th, 1940, Italy joined World War II on Germany's side. At the same time, the Italian Navy officially adopted the SLC guided torpedo, and they immediately started their drills at the secret base in the mouth of the Serchio River for sabotage missions against the British Navy located in the Mediterranean Sea. In 1940-41, fleet frogmen on the SLC guided torpedoes executed 8 raids on the main British naval bases in Gibraltar, Malta and Alexandria. Most of the missions failed, but the Italians persistently mastered the combat application and equipment of their guided torpedoes.
The levers and the controls in here, apart from the steering controls, we have valves which control the air in the ballast tanks, again to assist the depth of the underwater submersible. The whole contraption is more like a fairground ride than it is a serious war machine. But you know, in 1942, 1943, when this was used, they were prepared to try anything, and they would launch these in the dead of night, and then they would go into harbours to cause as much damage as they possibly could.
At the end of 1941, the Axis launched another offensive on the English ships. The naval situation was more than just satisfactory. Owing to the successful actions of the German submarines, there were only 2 battleships left in the British Mediterranean fleet, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. Both ships were located in the Alexandria port. On December the 14th, submarine Shearer, carrying 3 SLC guided torpedoes and 10 frogmen, left the secluded Porto Lago Bay on Leros Island and set sail towards Alexandria. On the 4th day of sailing, soon after sunset, the submarine reached its destination point 1.5 miles from the Alexandria trading port. On December the 18th, 1941, around midnight, a commando team set off for a mission on 3 guided torpedoes. They were approaching the harbour entrance semi-submerged. The entrance was blocked by a steel net that could become a serious threat to the mission. But Fortuna smiled upon the frogmen. The English had removed the barriers to let their destroyers into the base. The Italians seized the moment and entered the harbour together with the destroyers. The teams separated once they'd entered the harbour. The mines were planted on Queen Elizabeth precisely as planned. The commandos fixed a tow line on the bilge keels and set up a charge exactly under the keel. The mines were also planted on tanker Sagona without any issues. But the crew that were mining battleship Valiant encountered some difficulties. Within a few meters of the ship, the breathing apparatus of one of the commandos failed, forcing him to surface. Then their torpedo died in the water and sank due to a technical failure. Lieutenant Luigi de la Penna trawled the torpedo all by himself and left it under the bottom of the battleship, close to the magazine of the first turret. In the morning of December the 19th, 3 explosions blasted in the Alexandria port. That's how 6 commandos on 3 guided torpedoes managed to shift the naval balance in the Mediterranean Sea in favor of the Italians. However, not for long. The Italians tried to keep their superweapon a secret, but the British successfully procured several of the human torpedoes. In August 1943, the guided torpedo fleet executed their last successful mission using the Maiali. Italy capitulated several weeks later, and all its military secrets fell into the hands of the Allies.
The true potential of deck aviation was revealed during World War II. Aircraft carriers and their numerous squadrons managed to forever change the combat rules at sea, as well as the future of naval development. Skilled commanders often need to learn over dozens of battles how to effectively deploy squadrons and inflict significant damage to their enemies. In the next episode, we're going to tell you about the development of U.S. naval aviation, starting with the establishment of the first naval base in the country.
Pensacola's association with naval aviation dates back to 1914 and the creation of the country's first naval air station. And in this episode of Naval Legends, we'll be tracing over the development of the air arm of the US Navy.
In 1910, one of the aviation pioneers, Glenn Curtiss, supported by US Navy, prepared an ambitious experiment. It included cruiser USS Birmingham and an aircraft constructed by Curtiss and piloted by Eugene Ely, a test pilot.
As he strapped himself into his Curtiss Hudson Flyer aboard the light cruiser USS Birmingham on the 14th of November 1910, Eugene Ely, then 24 years of age, could hardly have known that he was partaking in the birth of one of the most powerful weapon systems of the 20th century. Only a few minutes later, he'd make history as the first man to ever launch an aircraft from the deck of a ship.
2 months later, in January 1911, Curtiss, Ely, and US Navy carried out another demonstration in the San Francisco Bay, where cruiser USS Pennsylvania with a flight deck on her was moored.
Ely flew from the Presidio, which is an Army fort in San Francisco, about 15 miles down the bay, and landed on the flight deck, which had been equipped with about 20 manila ropes with sea bags at the end of the ropes. The airplane had a grappling hook underneath it, and when he touched down on the flight deck, the grappling hook caught 5 of the wires. He stopped in about 30 feet, and that was the first landing of an aircraft on a ship at sea.
Aircraft specifications for Curtiss Pusher, Model D4. Length, almost 8 meters. Wingspan, more than 10 meters. Takeoff weight, 590 kilograms. Engine, Curtiss. Power, 40 HP. Maximum speed, 80 kilometers per hour. Crew, 1 person. Despite the obvious success of Curtiss's experiments, the idea of specialized aircraft carrying ships did not come to fruition for a very long time in the USA. The High Command of the US Navy treated airplanes as auxiliary equipment of a warship. Admirals believed that aircraft could not become a fully fledged strike force for the fleet. They were restricted to reconnaissance and artillery spotting missions, and they were mostly seaplanes. World War I spurred the progress of the US naval aviation to some extent, but it was aimed mostly at the increase in number of seaplanes.
When we entered World War I in April 1917, we had no carriers at this time yet, but we had many flying boats, and when the World War I ended in November 1918, we had over 200 twin-engine Curtiss flying boats flying combat. So the first submarine ever sunk by a aircraft was sunk by a Curtiss H-16 flying boat in 1918.
During World War I, aircraft began to change shape and form. Gone were the fragile-looking open trusses with webs of bracing wire. Replacing them came more modern biplanes with continuous skin covering on a fuselage, more powerful engines, and more powerful armament. Case in point, this VE-7 Bluebird. VE-7 was to become the US Navy's first carrier-launched fighter.
Aircraft specifications for VE-7 Bluebird. Length 7.5 meters, wingspan 10.5 meters, takeoff weight 879 kilograms, engine Wright Hispano E3, power 180 HP, maximum speed 171 kilometers per hour, service ceiling 4,500 meters, armament 1 or 2 machine guns, caliber 7.62 millimeter, crew 1 person. At the end of World War I, when the British built their first true aircraft carrier with a flight deck stretching from aft to bow, everyone understood that planes would be an integral part of future naval fleets. That's why in 1920, the US Navy refitted its old collier, USS Jupiter, removed a part of its superstructure and constructed a 160-meter-long flight deck on her. Renamed USS Langley, the ship was commissioned in 1922 and became the first aircraft carrier of the US Navy. Initially, Langley served as an experimental platform where the basis for battle application of deck aircraft was laid down and a new school of shipbuilding was created.
Taking off was not an issue. We didn't use a catapult in those days. The planes were able to take off on the flight deck, but the landing was the issue. So initially, not only did they have the arresting wires that go across the flight deck like you see on modern carriers, they also had cables that ran perpendicular with the flight deck, in other words, fore and aft. They had a hook, a tail hook, and you also had what looked like an anchor, or several anchors, little small anchors on a rod between the main wheels, and they hooked into the fore and aft wires. So it's kind of a spider web nightmare. After about a year, we realized that we did not need the fore and aft wires, so we just went with the cross-deck wires, and it worked out fine.
In the autumn of 1920, the Deputy Commander of the US Air Force, Brigadier General Mitchell, declared that aviation can destroy, disable, and sink any existing warship, as well as any other built in future. Next year, in the summer, tests were conducted. They showed that aircraft is quite capable of sinking even a battleship by dropping a sufficient number of powerful bombs on it. The results of these tests led the Navy to the conclusion that their ships needed reinforced anti-aircraft defenses and thicker horizontal armor. Advocates of naval aviation were already imagining squadrons of deck aircraft sinking enemy ships. All they needed was to modernize airplanes and develop a bomb-dropping technique.
In the mid-1920s, Curtiss presented to the Navy their design for a land-based fighter, the F6c. It had a powerful engine and had great maneuverability and speed, as befitted Curtiss's legacy for making maneuverable sports aircraft and breaking speed records. It even came with an auxiliary fuel tank as an option. The aircraft was famous for being one of the first to try dive bombing as a technique. And the aircraft entered service, particularly taking part in Lexington's commissioning ceremony as part of her air wing.
Aircraft specifications for F6c Hawk. Length almost 7 meters. Wingspan 11.5 meters. Takeoff weight 1,238 kilograms. Engine Pratt & Whitney R13403 Wasp. Power 410 HP. Maximum speed 255 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 7,000 meters. Armament 2 Browning machine guns, caliber 7.62 millimeter. 2 bombs weighing 52.6 kilograms. Crew 1 person.
The F6c had its biggest problem was that it had a water jacket around it. It was built kind of like a car. The engine was called an inline engine. It was a better looking airplane, but when warplanes get shot at and a water jacket around, just like on your car, you put one bullet in that water jacket, the water's going to go out and the plane is going to stop. So it was not a successful airplane. F7C that followed it was they used the what they call jugs, separate individual cylinders.
So the advantages to that for the Navy, as opposed to a liquid-cooled engine, was that you eliminated the entire cooling system, which involved a radiator, water lines, some sort of cooling scoop or vent or something for the radiator, and you also eliminated a massive amount of maintenance. After the F-7C in the late 20s, every Navy operational fighter, reciprocating fighter, had a radial engine that operated off a carrier. Everyone knows associates Boeing with airliners, but Boeing was, back in the 20s, was a very big supplier of fighters to the Navy. They had one particular line of fighters, the F4B fighters, which the last version came out in 1932, the F4B-4.
Aircraft specifications for F4B. Length 6.2 meters. Wingspan more than 9 meters. Takeoff weight 1,323 kilograms. Engine Pratt & Whitney R1340E Wasp. Power 550 HP. Maximum speed 301 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 8,400 meters. Armament 2 Browning machine guns, caliber 7.62 millimeter. In the bomber variant, the aircraft could carry up to 227 kilograms of bombs. Crew 1 person.
Especially in the 20s, when their aviation advancements were happening at a very high rate. Aerodynamics, engines, airframes. There was a lot of competition amongst the manufacturers because people were making better airplanes every year. So someone would turn out a very good fighter. A year later, somebody would turn out an even better fighter.
In the early 1930s, the Bureau of Aeronautics, the organization responsible for the development and acquisition of naval aircraft and its associated materiel, allegedly asked Grumman to design a retractable gear system for the Boeing F-4B-4. Well, Grumman's engineers had patented their design and weren't inclined to share it with somebody else. Besides, they said, you couldn't actually fit a retractable system to the Boeing aircraft. Only a month later, however, they developed and presented to the Navy a new two-seat fighter aircraft. Coincidentally, the Navy had only recently issued a requirement for a new series of fighter aircraft. The Grumman FF1, sometimes known as the Goblin, met all these requirements. The FF1 was revolutionary: a duralumin skin, enclosed cockpit, and of course, retractable gear. In 1933, 25 of these aircraft formed the air group for the carrier Lexington.
Aircraft specifications for FF1 Goblin. Length 7.5 meters. Wingspan 10.5 meters. Takeoff weight 2,111 kilograms. Engine Wright R182078. Power 700 HP. Maximum speed 323 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 6,700 meters. Armament 3 Browning machine guns, caliber 7.62 millimeter. 2 bombs weighing 52.6 kilograms. Crew 2 persons.
This is the only one in the world, the one that we have. We found it in a junkyard down in Nicaragua. As a matter of fact, Navy pilot found it down there. It's crop dusting down there several decades back now. And he called the Navy, or he called the Grumman people, and they said, we'll be right down. 8 years later, it came up here to the museum. They flew it into the museum. One of the few that's been flown into the museum. Most of these airplanes come in pieces and we put them together here.
The Great Depression of 1929 ruined many enterprises and almost destroyed the Curtiss Company, which had been supplying the Army and the Navy with cutting-edge aircraft throughout the course of the 1920s. However, Curtiss survived, and in 1933 followed Grumman in constructing an airplane with retractable chassis and duralumin skin. The Navy planned to put the new Curtiss aircraft into service aboard a freshly built carrier that was launched the same year. However, its fighter wing had been already completed, and the command decided to repurpose the new Curtiss plane as a bomber with the BF-2C-1 designation. Curtiss's engineers networked their design according to its new specialization and installed additional gear for bomb suspension.
It was one of the early dive bombers again. They started trying to dive bomb by just putting a bomb on the fuselage. A bomb has better aerodynamics than an airplane, so the bomb would accelerate. When you're going into this 60, 70, 80 degrees nose down, the bomb would accelerate and go into the propeller. And what they did was they had this trapeze-like outfit, undercarriage that would swing out and allow the bomb to clear the propeller.
In the 1930s, the biplane began to give way to the monoplane, and the US Navy did not feel like being left behind in these advancements. It was at this point that Grumman presented to the Navy their new fighter designed for a monoplane, the F4F3. Now, the Navy already had the Buffalo, but the Grumman design intrigued them. Firstly, it was very fast. The prototype in trials hit a speed of 287 knots. It was highly maneuverable. It had a powerful armament of 4 caliber 50 Browning machine guns, and the pilot sat high. The nose had an 8-degree downward slope, which meant that the pilot could then keep visual contact with the target even at high angles of lead. After a number of modifications to the prototype, the Navy ordered it into series production.
Aircraft specifications for F4F3 Wildcat. Length, almost 9 meters. Wingspan, 11.5 meters. Takeoff weight, 3,367 kilogram. Engine, Pratt & Whitney R183076. Power, 1,200 HP. Maximum speed, 533 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling, 9,950 meters. Armament, 4 Browning machine guns, caliber 12.7 millimeter. The aircraft could carry 2 50-kilogram bombs. Crew, 1 person. The design was so successful that both the British and French became interested in the aircraft. As a result, the Wildcat was put into service by the Royal Navy earlier than in the US Navy.
Now, one of the rather obsolete features of the Wildcat was it did have retracting landing gear. That was the good news, but the bad news was the pilot had to crank the gear up by hand. So when you launched off the carrier, you spent the first minute airborne cranking the landing gear up. So that kind of, you couldn't form up or do much anything but get the gear up, so that was a little hard to deal with. But of course the advantage to that was there was no hydraulic system to shoot out. So by cranking the gear up, you eliminated the system.
By the end of the 1930s, the US deck aviation had grown quite big muscles. The Navy had 7 aircraft carriers in active service, and several more were being constructed. Airplane designers supplied the American fleet with the updated modern aircraft almost every year. In the 1920s and 30s, the US Navy carried out a number of exercises which demonstrated an enormous potential of strike air groups. In 1938, squadrons from the carrier USS Saratoga conducted a successful training attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor. But considering that the American fleet was stationed in California at that time, the results of this operation didn't draw too much attention. Nothing interesting, just another exercise. On December the 7th, 1941, the United States entered World War II. And it was on that day the numerous critics of aircraft carrier tactics within US Navy Command realized the degree of their error. Together with the line warships of the Pacific Fleet, the flames of Pearl Harbor burnt down the very doctrine of absolute domination of heavy artillery ships in naval war. In an instant, All books on the art of naval warfare became obsolete, and there was no time to write new ones. The enemy had to be repelled, and they had to be struck with their own weapon.
On December 7th, the Navy had 3 carriers in the Pacific Ocean. We only had 3 carriers there. We only had a total of 7 carriers. Japan had 14 carriers. So the first thing we needed was more carriers, but the problem with that is that it takes 2 years to build a carrier.
The second problem was that the main fighter aircraft of the US Navy, the F6f Wildcat, was inferior to the Japanese Zero in all respects.
The Mitsubishi A6M Zeke, commonly known as the Zero. This was arguably the premier fighter in the Pacific theater until about 1943. It had a number of advantages. Firstly, it's lightweight. It had an aluminium-magnesium alloy frame, and this meant it was highly maneuverable. Had excellent firepower. It had both cannon and machine gun. Had excellent vision from its high-mounted canopy. The only drawback was it was a tad fragile, but first you had to hit it.
Zero was much faster. It could outclimb, outdive, and outturn a Wildcat. How did we use this old airplane and manage to make it work so well? The first thing I already mentioned, it was very, very rugged, very difficult to shoot down. The fuel tank had a self-sealing bladder in it, so when a bullet went through it, it sealed itself up. You didn't lose your gas, which was important when you're 100 miles, 150 kilometers from your carrier. The pilot sat in an armored tub, basically, like a bathtub. He had steel plate all around him. So the plane was very survivable. The other thing you had to do, if you're a Wildcat pilot, you had to do formation flying. You had to be with another Wildcat to protect each other. So if one Wildcat got jumped, he could maneuver and try to pull the Zero in front of the other Wildcat.
3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, American carrier aviation achieved its first victory. The author of this victory flew the SPD Dauntless.
Dauntless was responsible for the first kill by US naval aviation on an enemy combatant. The Dauntless was flown by Lieutenant Dickinson, who was assigned to the Enterprise Air Group, and he had survived being jumped at Pearl Harbor with the loss of his rear seater. On December the 10th, it sighted the Japanese submarine I-70 and attacked and sank her. Features of the aircraft related to the wing include the very large and visible dive brakes required for its role. Less visible is the fact that the wing has no internal spars. Now this makes it lighter, but a significant drawback is the fact that you cannot fold this aircraft's wing. Despite this, Dauntless entered service with the US Navy's fleet.
Aircraft specifications for the SPD Dauntless. Length 10 meters. Wingspan 12.6 meters. Maximum takeoff weight 4,587 kilograms. Engine R182032. Power 950 HP. Maximum speed 405 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 7,680 meters. Armament: 2 12.7mm Browning M2 machine guns and 2 7.62mm machine guns in rear. Bomb payload 725 kilograms. Crew 2 persons.
So the Dauntless was designed expressly for one thing and one thing only, and that was sinking ships. And it was very good at what it did. The Battle of Midway was probably the definitive battle where everyone knew that air power was going to be the only way you were going to win the Pacific. So at the Battle of Midway, which we're probably all familiar with, 3 US Navy carriers, the Enterprise, the Yorktown, and the Hornet, up against 4 Japanese carriers. The Japanese had a huge force with them, including several large battleships. They had over 100 fighting ships, and then they had an invasion force. The Navy had 3 carriers and about 20 other ships, not one battleship, because they'd all been damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor.
Early in the morning of June the 4th, about 45 Dauntlesses attacked the Japanese task force. The lightning-fast strike of the American dive bombers ended in a sweeping victory. In just a few hours, the Dauntlesses destroyed almost half the carriers of the Japanese Imperial Navy, thus turning the tide of the Pacific War. This battle was also notable because it was here that the Avenger torpedo bomber made its debut.
Grumman Avenger was the largest aircraft that we operated off carriers in World War II. It replaced the Douglas Devastator torpedo bomber, which was obsolete in 1941.
Aircraft specifications for the TBM Avenger. Length 12.5 meters. Wingspan 16.5 meters. Takeoff weight 7,876 kilograms. Engine Wright R26008. Power 1,700 HP. Maximum speed 415 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 7,193 meters. Armament 3 12.7mm machine guns and 1 7.62mm machine gun under the fuselage. 8 127mm HVAR rockets. The aircraft could carry up to 907 kilograms of bombs or 1 Mark 13 torpedo. Crew 3 persons.
Early on, they could do torpedo runs, or they could be used as a dive bomber. So if you were attacking an airfield, the Avengers could be dive bombers. They could come back to the carrier, and if somebody saw Japanese ships were sighted, they could load them with torpedoes and go out on a torpedo run.
By the end of 1942, the Avengers had distinguished themselves by sinking Japanese carrier Ryujo during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and battleship Hiei in the first battles for Guadalcanal. However, the finest hour of these torpedo bombers was yet to come, when in 1942, the Avengers joined the Dauntlesses and Wildcats, which had borne the weight of the initial phase of the air war against Japan. Meanwhile, US industry prepared replacements for the battle-battered aircraft fleet.
The F6f Hellcat, known as the Ace Maker, arguably the most significant carrier-borne aircraft of World War II, and was responsible for some 75% of the Navy's kills. 12,274 were built by Grumman, 1 an hour every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was simple, it was reliable, it was rugged. It had claimed 5,157 enemy kills for a loss of only 270. Another nickname it earned was the aluminum tank, and it earned for the manufacturer the moniker Grumman Iron Works. Indeed, some pilots spoke of returning home with battle damage so significant that more air was passing through the aircraft than around it.
Aircraft specifications for F6f Hellcat. Length more than 10 meters. Wingspan 13 meters. Takeoff weight 6,754 kilograms. Engine Pratt & Whitney R2800 10W double wasp. Power 2,135 HP. Maximum speed 629 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 11,278 meters. Armament 6 12.7mm Colt Browning M2 machine guns. 6 127mm HVAR rockets. Bomb payload up to 907 kilograms. Crew 1 person.
When it was all said and done at the end of the war, the Hellcat had a 19-to-1 kill ratio, which meant for every Hellcat shot down air-to-air, Hellcat shot down 19 Japanese aircraft, which at that point in the war, many of them were fighters.
In 1943, the US Pacific Fleet began to put heavy strike aircraft carriers from the Essex class into service, each of which could carry up to 100 planes on board. The war had reached a stage where the success of combat operations was defined by the economic power of the warring parties.
So it was a huge advantage that we had that the Japanese did not have. They did not have anywhere near the capability to match us in production. So by mid-44, pretty much everywhere we went, we had a huge carrier force to back up whatever was happening.
In 1943, Grumman, the main manufacturer of fighters for the US Navy, had to make room for another company. New aircraft carriers boasted 4FU Corsairs produced by Vought on their flight decks. However, this machine did not become a competitor for Grumman's Hellcats. The Corsair had other purposes.
Corsair's introduction into service hit some snags with carrier qualifications. It exhibited some really nasty low-speed stall characteristics, the landing gear wasn't suitable, and it also had such a powerful engine that the torque caused roll as well as yaw due to P-factor. Finally, the long nose meant that on final approach you couldn't actually see the carrier you were trying to land on, although the solution for that was a long curve which kept your eyes on the target. As a result, Corsair entered service as a land-based aircraft with the Marines in early '43.
Aircraft specifications for the F4U Corsair. Length, more than 10 meters. Wingspan, 12.5 meters. Takeoff weight, 6,654 kilograms. Engine, Pratt & Whitney R2800-18W. Power, 2,380 HP. Maximum speed, 718 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling, 12,802 meters. Armament, 6 12.7mm Colt Browning M2 machine guns. 8 127mm HPAR rockets. Bomb payload up to 907 kilograms. Crew, 1 person.
The Marines used it heavily. It was more of a Marine aircraft in World War II. The Navy primarily flew the Hellcat. Corsair first flew in 1940. It was extremely advanced for its day. It was the first US Navy fighter that could go 400 miles an hour straight and level. It has a very odd wing arrangement. It's got a gull wing, and the reason for that is because of the size of the propeller. If you had a regular wing, the landing gear would be so long that you'd have to have a huge wing for the landing gear to fold up into, so the Vought engineers came up with that very unusual design.
In 1943, on the basis that the war was going to continue a while longer, work was started on the development of a successor to the F6f Hellcat. The result was known as the engine with a saddle on it. It was the F8f Bearcat. An interesting design feature at the time was the addition of exploding wingtips. The idea was that if the maneuvers were so hard that there was risk of a complete structural failure of the wing, the outer meter or so of each wing would detach. Never really worked in practice though. Either one tip would detach and not the other, or just simply at different times. The solution was to add explosive charges. However, it never worked according to plan, and indeed an accident with an explosion killed a Navy technician. So production aircraft soon had that idea removed.
Aircraft specifications for the F8f Bearcat. Length, almost 8.5 meters. Wingspan, almost 11 meters. Takeoff weight, 6,105 kilograms. Engine, Pratt & Whitney R2800-30W. Double Wasp. Power, 2,250 HP. Maximum speed, 737 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling, 11,247 meters. Armament, 4 20mm cannons. 4 127mm HPAR rockets. Bomb payload up to 1,700 kilograms. Crew 1 person. By the time the F6f Bearcat was mass-produced, the Hellcats and Corsairs were already dominating the skies over the Pacific Ocean, while the Helldivers and Avengers were finishing off the remnants of the Japanese Navy. In October 1944, the Americans sank 27 Japanese ships in the Leyte Gulf, including 4 aircraft carriers and 3 battleships. The following year, in April, 227 planes from 9 American carriers destroyed the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the mighty Yamato. When U.S. troops began landing at Okinawa, aircraft carrier USS Midway was launched back home in the USA. She would become a symbol of the American Navy's power for many years to come.
In the early 1940s, the Bureau of Aeronautics learned about the developments of jet engine technology in England and Germany and asked Westinghouse and Alice Chalmers to make American versions. The initial responses, though, were not positive. These early jets had low power at low speed, they were unreliable, and they had high fuel consumption. Add to that the requirements for swept wings, which seemed necessary for maneuverability, and it became unsuitable for carrier use. After the war, though, with the development of the threat from the Soviet Union and their jet program, it became obvious that the Navy could no longer avoid the technology. In 1947, the FH-1 Phantom entered fleet service, and with that, the age of naval aviation jets began.
Thank you all for watching. To activate a bonus code, log into the game's website. See you in the next episode on September 16th. But most importantly, come visit our celebratory stream dedicated to the 5th anniversary of the game on September 17th.